A man died in 1837 from a bullet wound to the abdomen, and Russia lost the writer who invented its literary language. But before the duel, before the exile, before the fame, there was a child who shouldn't have mattered at all. His family's fortune was gone. His parents barely noticed him, and he carried African blood in a country that would never let him forget it. This is Alexander Pushkin, and everything about his story defies what you think you know about how genius emerges. Moscow in 1799 wasn't the gleaming imperial capital. It was the old capital, the traditional one, increasingly overshadowed by St. Petersburg's European ambitions. Into this world, on May 26th, Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin arrived. His father, Sergei Lvovich, belonged to an ancient noble line that traced back to the 12th century. Impressive on paper, meaningless in practice, the family had been declining for generations. By the time Alexander was born, they occupied that awkward space between aristocracy and irrelevance, minor nobility. It's a special kind of purgatory. You have the name, but not the money. The expectations, but not the means. You're invited to the right gatherings, but can't afford the right clothes. Sergei Lvovich spent his life performing gentility he couldn't sustain, playing the cultured nobleman while the estate crumbled and debts accumulated. Alexander's mother, Nadezhda Osipovna, came from different stock entirely. Her grandfather was Abram Petrovich Ganibal, and this is where the story gets strange. Ganibal was African. Not metaphorically, not distantly. He was kidnapped as a child from somewhere near Lake Chad in what's now Cameroon, sold to the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople, then given as a gift to Peter the Great. Peter was building his new Russia, his window to Europe, and he had peculiar ideas about proving Russian superiority. One way was to take this African child and educate him in France as a military engineer, demonstrating that any person, regardless of origin, could achieve greatness under Russian rule. Ganibal became a general, a nobleman, governor of Revel, one of the most powerful men in the empire. His descendants inherited his position, but also his difference. Pushkin grew up acutely aware that he looked unlike other Russian nobles. His hair curled tightly, his skin was darker. His features marked him as other, in a society obsessed with European standards of appearance. This would matter. It would matter in ways that shaped everything he wrote. But in childhood, what mattered more was that nobody particularly cared about him. His father was absorbed in maintaining appearances and literary salons where cultured men discussed French philosophy and recited mediocre verses. His mother was busy with her own social life, maintaining the fiction of status the family no longer possessed. The children, Alexander and his siblings, were raised by others, specifically by their maternal grandmother Alexeyevna and by Irina Rodionovna Yakovleva, their nanny. Irina was a serf, a peasant woman who belonged to the family as property. She couldn't read or write, but she knew stories, Russian folk tales passed down through generations, fairy tales about firebirds and magical fish and witches who lived in huts that walked on chicken legs. She told these stories to Alexander in Russian, the language of the people, not the French his parents spoke in their salon. This created a strange linguistic split in Pushkin's childhood. French was the language of culture, of literature, of everything that mattered to educated Russians. Russian was what you spoke to servants, what you heard in the streets, what peasants used. The idea that Russian could be a literary language, that it could express complex thoughts and beautiful poetry, would have seemed absurd to most of Pushkin's class. Alexander learned French first. He read voraciously in his father's library, consuming French literature, losing himself in Voltaire and Molière. But those folk tales from Irina, those stories in Russian, planted something else. A sense that this language, rough and dismissed as it was, contained something vital. The family didn't know what to do with him. He was too clever, too energetic, too obviously different from his siblings. His father found him irritating. His mother was distant. He spent his early childhood somewhat isolated, reading obsessively, listening to stories, developing an inner life that had little to do with the disappointed nobility surrounding him. Then in 1811 something changed. Tsar Alexander I founded a new school, the Imperial Lyceum at Tsarskoye Selo, the imperial residence near St. Petersburg. It was designed to educate the sons of nobility for important government service. 30 students would be selected for the first class, ages 10 to 12, and they would receive 6 years of education, equivalent to a university degree. Getting Alexander into the Lyceum required connections the family barely possessed, but they managed it. On October 19th, 1811, 12-year-old Alexander Pushkin arrived at Tsarskoye Selo and entered a world completely unlike anything he'd known. The Lyceum wasn't just a school, it was an experiment in creating a new kind of Russian elite. Students lived on campus, isolated from their families, educated intensively in Russian history, philosophy, law, literature, languages. The curriculum was remarkably liberal for Imperial Russia. One of the key instructors was Alexander Kunitsin, who taught philosophy based on Kantian liberal individualism and Enlightenment principles. Kunitsin taught that individuals had natural rights, that government existed to serve the people, that freedom and reason should guide human affairs. These weren't just academic concepts, they were dangerous ideas in an autocratic empire. Pushkin absorbed them completely. Years later, he'd commemorate Kunitsin in his poetry, crediting him with shaping his intellectual foundation. But the real education happened between classes. 30 boys, many of them brilliant, all of them ambitious, thrown together for 6 years. They formed intense friendships, bitter rivalries, lifelong bonds. They published handwritten journals, staged debates, wrote poetry, and shared it mercilessly. Pushkin stood out immediately, but not always positively. He was arrogant, competitive, too aware of his own talents. He argued constantly, needed to win every verbal sparring match, dominated conversations. Some classmates found him insufferable. Others recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Because he was writing constantly, not just school assignments, poetry, dozens of poems, then over 100. By the time he graduated, he'd written approximately 130 poems. Some were juvenilia, awkward attempts at classical forms, but others showed flashes of something new, a voice that didn't sound like anyone else writing in Russian. In 1814, when Pushkin was 15, one of his poems was published in The Messenger of Europe, a respected literary journal. This wasn't a school publication. This was the real literary world, and they were taking a 15-year-old seriously. The literary establishment in St. Petersburg started paying attention. The Lyceum years gave Pushkin something beyond education. They gave him a cohort, a generation of young men who believed they could reshape Russia. Many of them would become Decembrists, revolutionaries who'd attempt to overthrow the autocracy. Pushkin wouldn't join their uprising, but he'd share their ideals, and that association would haunt him for years. In 1817, Pushkin graduated from the Lyceum. He was 18 years old, already somewhat famous in literary circles, and had no clear idea what to do next. The obvious path was government service. That's what Lyceum graduates did. They took positions in ministries, climbed the bureaucratic ladder, served the empire. Pushkin accepted a nominal position in the Foreign Office. It required almost nothing of him. He showed up occasionally, collected a salary, and spent his time doing what he actually cared about. Writing poetry, attending theatre, arguing in salons, and living the life of a young man who believed he was destined for greatness. Saint. Petersburg's literary world was small, intense, and fractured by competing schools and personalities. Pushkin threw himself into it. He joined the Green Lamp, a secret society that was part literary club, part political discussion group. They met to discuss literature and philosophy, but also to talk about reform, about the need to change Russia's rigid, autocracy. Pushkin's poetry from this period shows someone trying on different voices, testing what he could do. He wrote erotic verses that scandalized proper society. He wrote political epigrams, mocking powerful officials. He wrote a longer poem, Ruslan and Ludmila, that retold a Russian fairy tale with humor and irreverence that offended traditionalists. Ruslan and Ludmila became his first major controversy. When it was published in 1820, critics attacked it as vulgar, as treating sacred Russian folklore with inappropriate levity, as showing foreign influence where pure Russian spirit should dominate. The debate revealed fault lines in Russian literary culture that would persist for decades. What should Russian literature be? Should it imitate European forms or create something distinctly Russian? Should it be serious and moral, or could it be playful and subversive? Pushkin didn't particularly care about these debates in abstract terms. He wrote what interested him, what felt alive, but his instinct was consistently toward innovation, toward breaking rules, toward making Russian do things it hadn't done before. The poetry that would destroy his comfortable St. Petersburg life wasn't Ruslan and Ludmila. It was his political epigrams and his Ode to Liberty, a poem that dared to suggest limits on autocratic power, that invoked the execution of emperors who violated their social contract with the people. In 1820, these poems circulated in manuscript throughout St. Petersburg. Everyone who mattered read them. They were brilliant, dangerous, and unmistakably Pushkin's. Tsar Alexander I was not amused. The young poet who'd been such a promising Lyceum graduate was now a threat, spreading seditious ideas through his verses. The punishment could have been severe. Pushkin could have been sent to Siberia, imprisoned, destroyed. Instead, through the intervention of influential friends, he received something softer: exile to southern Russia, officially a transfer to a new government post, actually a removal from the capital where his influence was growing too strong. In May 1820, Alexander Pushkin left St. Petersburg. He was 21 years old. He'd been free in the capital for 3 years, had published his first major work, had made his mark on literary society. Now he was being sent away, and he had no idea when or if he'd be allowed to return. The journey south took him through landscapes he'd never seen. The Caucasus Mountains, wild and dramatic, Crimea, with its foreign atmosphere and Eastern influences. These weren't just geographical destinations. They were imaginative territories, places that would transform his poetry. He was supposed to report to Kishinev in Bessarabia, now part of Moldova, for his new government posting. But along the way, he travelled, absorbed new experiences, and started writing differently. The exile that was meant to silence him was instead liberating him from the expectations and controversies of St. Petersburg. In the Caucasus, he encountered a world unlike anything in his previous experience. Mountains that seemed to touch the sky, local peoples with their own cultures and languages, a sense of wildness and freedom that Sant, Petersburg's rigid society, had crushed. He started writing The Prisoner of the Caucasus, his first Byronic verse tale, a long narrative poem influenced by Byron's exotic Eastern tales, but translated into a Russian context. This was new. Russian literature had long poems, but nothing quite like this. Pushkin was creating a Russian Romanticism, taking European forms and making them express specifically Russian experiences and landscapes. The poem told the story of a Russian prisoner held by mountain tribesmen, his relationship with a local woman, his eventual escape. It combined adventure, romance, ethnographic detail, and psychological depth in ways Russian readers hadn't seen before. By the time Pushkin reached his official posting in Kishinev, he'd already begun transforming his exile into artistic opportunity. The 3 years he'd spend in southern Russia would be among his most productive, generating work that would establish him as Russia's preeminent poet, even as he remained hundreds of miles from the capital. Kishinev was a backwater, a provincial town in the far reaches of the Russian Empire, close to the Ottoman border, filled with merchants, soldiers, and local officials who had little interest in poetry. For someone who'd spent 3 years in St. Petersburg's glittering salons, it should have been unbearable. Pushkin made it work. His official duties as a government clerk were minimal and mostly ignored. He had a small salary, enough to live on but nothing extravagant. What he had was time. Time to read, to write, to explore this strange new world he'd been dropped into. The local society was limited but welcoming. He befriended military officers stationed there, attended what passed for social gatherings in a frontier town, and started learning about the cultures that surrounded him. Bessarabia was a crossroads, a place where Russian, Moldavian, Turkish, and Greek influences mixed. The ethnic diversity fascinated him. He also joined something unexpected, the Philiki Eteria, a secret Greek revolutionary society plotting to overthrow Ottoman rule in Greece. This wasn't mere romantic posturing. The organisation was serious, with members throughout the region, planning an actual uprising. Pushkin's involvement was probably more sympathetic than active, but it showed where his political sympathies lay. He wasn't just writing about freedom, he was associating with people willing to fight for it. The Prisoner of the Caucasus was published in 1822 and became a sensation. Russian readers had never encountered anything quite like it. The exotic setting, the romantic hero, the tragic love story, all told in verse that moved like nothing else in Russian literature. It was Byron transplanted into Russian soil, but it was also uniquely Pushkin's. The poem's success established him as more than a promising young talent. He was now a major literary figure, and this from exile, hundreds of miles from the cultural centre. The distance didn't matter. His work travelled where he couldn't. He followed it with The Fountain of Bakhchisarai, another Byronic tale, this one set in a Crimean palace and exploring themes of captivity, desire, and cultural collision. Then The Gypsies, perhaps his finest work from this period, a narrative poem that used the romantic conventions but pushed towards something darker and more psychologically complex. The pattern was clear. Exile was feeding his imagination rather than stifling it. Every new landscape, every unfamiliar culture, every restriction placed on his movement became material for transformation into art. But he was also getting restless. Through influential friends, particularly General Ivan Inzov, who'd been protecting him in Kishinev, Pushkin secured a transfer to Odessa in July 1823. This was a significant upgrade. Odessa was a real city, cosmopolitan and sophisticated, a major port on the Black Sea with theatres, social life, European influences. His new supervisor was Count Mikhail Vorontsov, the Governor-General of New Russia. This would prove complicated. Odessa gave Pushkin something closer to the life he'd known in St. Petersburg. There were balls to attend, theatres to visit, women to pursue. He threw himself into all of it with characteristic intensity. He had affairs with married women, including, most dangerously, Countess Elizaveta Vorontsova, the wife of his supervisor. Count Vorontsov was not pleased. The relationship between the Count and the poet deteriorated rapidly. Vorontsov saw Pushkin as an upstart troublemaker, someone who didn't take his government position seriously and who was causing scandal with his behaviour. Pushkin saw Vorontsov as a pompous bureaucrat, a man without understanding or appreciation of art. The tension was personal, but it was also about class and status. Pushkin came from old nobility, but his family had fallen in fortune and influence. Vorontsov was wealthy, powerful, connected to the highest levels of government. Each man looked down on the other for different reasons. Meanwhile, Pushkin was writing something that would change Russian literature forever. In May 1823, while still in Kishinev, he'd begun Eugene Onegin. It started as what seemed like another Byronic verse tale, but it was evolving into something entirely different. A novel in verse, a form that didn't quite exist in Russian literature. Following the story of a jaded aristocrat named Onegin, his friend Lenski, and Tatiana, the young woman who loves Onegin despite his cynical worldview. The structure was unique, 14-line stanzas with a complex rhyme scheme that Pushkin invented, what would later be called the Onegin stanza. The tone mixed romantic narrative with social satire, lyrical beauty with ironic distance. The narrator was a character himself, commenting on the action, digressing into personal reflections, making the reader constantly aware that this was a constructed story, even as the emotions felt completely real. Pushkin would work on Eugene Onegin for 8 years, publishing it in installments, revising constantly. It would become his masterpiece, the work that defined him as not just a poet, but as the creator of modern Russian literature. But in Odessa in 1824, it was still just beginning, and his situation was becoming impossible. The police had been intercepted a letter. Pushkin had written to a friend discussing his interest in atheism, specifically his admiration for English atheistic philosophy. In Nicholas I's Russia, this was dangerous. The government monitored everything, especially someone like Pushkin, who already had a record of political troublemaking. Count Vorontsov, seeing an opportunity to rid himself of a problematic subordinate, forwarded the letter to authorities in St. Petersburg. The response was swift. In July 1824, Pushkin was dismissed from government service and ordered to his mother's estate at Mikhailovskoye in Pskov province in northwestern Russia. This wasn't southern exile anymore. This was isolation in the Russian countryside, far from any city, under surveillance, with no clear end date. He was 25 years old, and it felt like his life was over. Mikhailovskoye was worse than he'd imagined. The estate was remote, surrounded by peasant villages and forests, the nearest town small and uninteresting. His parents were there initially, and the relationship was terrible. His father, possibly pressured by authorities, agreed to monitor his son's activities, essentially to spy on him. The household was tense, hostile. By November, his family had left, and Pushkin was alone except for the servants, particularly his old nurse, Arina Rodionovna, who'd cared for him as a child. This should have broken him. Instead, it transformed him. Alone in the countryside, cut off from the literary and social world he'd known, Pushkin discovered something unexpected. He started listening to Arina Rodionovna's stories, folk tales she'd known for decades, the oral tradition of Russian peasant culture. These weren't the French-influenced literary conventions he'd grown up with. This was something older, deeper, specifically Russian. He began studying Russian history intensively, reading everything he could find about the country's past. He visited neighbouring estates occasionally, conversed with local landowners, but mostly he was alone with books and his own thoughts. The isolation forced him inward, and what emerged was extraordinary. Over 2 years at Mikhailovskoye, Pushkin produced some of his greatest work. He completed The Gypsies, finished 3 chapters of Eugene Onegin, and wrote something that would prove to be one of the foundational works of Russian drama. Boris Godunov. Boris Godunov was unlike anything in Russian theatre. Inspired by Shakespeare, particularly the history plays, it told the story of Boris Godunov's troubled reign as Tsar and the appearance of a pretender claiming to be the murdered Tsarevich Dmitri. But more than the plot, what mattered was the approach. Pushkin rejected the classical French dramatic conventions that dominated Russian theatre. No adherence to the unities of time, place and action. No elevated, heroic style. Instead, he wrote in blank verse and prose, created scenes that moved across years and locations, included characters from all levels of society, from tsars to peasants. He was creating a Russian historical drama that drew on Russian chronicles and Russian folk traditions rather than importing French models. The play was about power, legitimacy, the relationship between rulers and the ruled, themes that resonated dangerously in an autocratic state. The government wouldn't allow it to be performed for years, but he kept writing lyrics, narrative poems, more chapters of Onegin, experiments in different forms and styles. The specifically Russian elements of his work became more pronounced during these years. Not because he was trying to be nationalist, but because isolation from European cultural centres forced him to engage more deeply with what was around him. His nurse Irina Rodionovna became his connection to an oral tradition that educated Russians typically ignored. The folk tales, the songs, the speech patterns of peasants, these entered his work in ways that would influence generations of Russian writers after him. Then in December 1825, everything changed again. Tsar Alexander I died unexpectedly while travelling in the south. His brother Constantine was supposed to succeed him, but had secretly renounced his claim. The next in line was Nicholas, younger, less experienced, and unknown to most of the country. The confusion created an opportunity. On December 14th, 1825, a group of military officers led their troops to Senate Square in St. Petersburg, refusing to swear allegiance to Nicholas. They demanded constitutional reform, limits on autocratic power, possibly even a republic. These were the Decembrists, named for the December uprising, and many of them were Pushkin's friends. He was stuck at Mikhailovskoye, unable to participate even if he'd wanted to. But he was implicated anyway. When the uprising was crushed and the participants arrested, interrogators found copies of Pushkin's political poems among their possessions. Everyone knew his Ode to Liberty, his epigrams against tyranny. The Decembrists had been inspired by his words. The new Tsar Nicholas I could have destroyed Pushkin. The connection to the conspirators was clear. But Nicholas was smarter than that. In September 1826, Pushkin was summoned to Moscow, where Nicholas was being crowned. The meeting between the 37-year-old emperor and the 27-year-old poet would determine Pushkin's fate, and, in many ways, the rest of his life. Nicholas asked Pushkin directly, "Would you have been in Senate Square if you'd been in Petersburg?" Pushkin answered honestly, "Yes." It was a dangerous admission, but Nicholas seemed to appreciate the candor. He offered Pushkin freedom from exile, permission to return to Moscow and Petersburg, but under conditions. The Tsar himself would be Pushkin's personal censor. Anything Pushkin wanted to publish would need imperial approval. Pushkin accepted. He had no choice. But the arrangement was more complex than it appeared. On one level, it gave him protection. With the Tsar as his censor, lower-level officials couldn't harass him as easily. On another level, it made him dependent on Nicholas's favour, a dangerous position for someone whose instincts ran toward independence and whose pen had already gotten him exiled twice. The 6 years of exile were over. Pushkin could return to the capitals, resume his place in society, publish his work. But the price was a leash, invisible but always present. The return to Moscow felt surreal. After 6 years of isolation, Pushkin was suddenly back in the centre of Russian cultural life. But everything had changed. The friends who'd survived the Decembrist purge were either broken or carefully silent. 5 of the uprising's leaders had been hanged. Over 100 others were sent to Siberia, their estates confiscated, their families ruined. The message was clear: Nicholas I would tolerate no challenge to his authority. Pushkin's position was unique and precarious. He had the Tsar's personal protection, which meant something, but he also had the Tsar's personal attention, which meant everything he did was watched. The third section, Nicholas's newly created secret police, kept files on him. His mail was opened, his movements tracked. The Tsar had granted him freedom, but it was freedom on a very short leash. He threw himself into Moscow's social life with characteristic intensity. Salons, balls, theatre openings. He was a celebrity now. The famous poet returned from exile. People wanted to see him, hear him, be near him. The attention was intoxicating after years of solitude. but it was also exhausting. He'd grown used to working alone, to living inside his own head. The constant social performance required something he wasn't sure he could sustain, and the work itself had become more complicated. Every poem now had to go through the Tsar's censorship. Nicholas would read it, make notes, sometimes suggest changes. The process was humiliating and unpredictable. Sometimes Nicholas would approve things that surprised everyone. Other times, he'd block publication for reasons that made no sense. There was no way to anticipate his reactions, no way to plan. The first major test came with Boris Godunov, the play Pushkin had written during his exile at Mikhailovskoye. It was his most ambitious work to date, a historical drama about a Tsar who'd murdered his way to the throne and been destroyed by guilt and popular uprising. The parallels to contemporary politics were impossible to miss. Pushkin submitted it to Nicholas in 1826, hoping for permission to publish or perform it. Nicholas's response was characteristically complex. He liked the play, or said he did, but he wouldn't allow it to be performed. It could be published eventually, but not staged. The distinction mattered. A published play reached educated readers who could interpret it carefully. A staged play reached crowds who might see in it a call to action. Boris Godunov wouldn't appear on a Russian stage until after Pushkin's death. Meanwhile, he continued work on Eugene Onegin. The novel in verse had been growing with him since 1823, absorbing his experiences, his changing perspectives, his developing craft. Each new chapter reflected where he was when he wrote it. The early sections, written during his southern exile, were romantic and Byron-influenced. The middle sections, from Mikhailovskoye, were darker, more psychologically complex. Now back in society, he was writing about society itself with a precision that only someone who'd been both inside and outside it could achieve. The character of Onegin was evolving too. Originally conceived as a simple Byronic hero, world-weary and cynical, he was becoming something more interesting. A man trapped by his own pose, unable to feel genuine emotion because he'd trained himself so thoroughly in ironic detachment. When Tatiana, the provincial girl who loves him, confesses her feelings, Onegin delivers a kind, patronizing rejection. He thinks he's being noble, sparing her from his corrupting influence. What he's actually doing is protecting himself from vulnerability. Years later, when they meet again, and Tatiana has become a sophisticated Petersburg society woman, married to a general, Onegin suddenly finds himself desperately in love with her. Now she's the one who rejects him, not coldly but firmly. She admits she still loves him, but she's married, and she won't betray her husband. The reversal is devastating. Onegin's emotional awakening comes too late. He's lost her through his own earlier cowardice. The novel captured something essential about Russian society in the 1820s. The educated class, raised on French literature and European ideas, found themselves alienated from their own country. They were too westernized to fit in with traditional Russian culture, but too Russian to be truly European. The result was a peculiar kind of paralysis, an inability to act because every action seemed absurd or impossible. Onegin embodied that paralysis perfectly. But Pushkin wasn't just writing about his generation's problems. He was writing about what it meant to be human in any time or place. The question the novel posed was fundamental. How do you live authentically in a society built on performance? How do you feel real emotions when everything around you is artificial? These weren't just Russian questions, they were universal. In 1828, something unexpected happened. Pushkin fell in love. Her name was Natalia Goncharova, and she was 16 years old. He met her at a ball in Moscow, and the effect was immediate. She was beautiful in a way that transcended mere physical attractiveness. There was something almost otherworldly about her, a quality that made everyone who saw her stop and stare. Pushkin was 29, established, famous, and completely undone. by this teenage girl. He began courting her immediately, with an intensity that probably should have alarmed her family. Her mother was cautious. The Goncharovs were old nobility, but they'd fallen on hard times financially. Pushkin was famous, yes, but he was also controversial. He'd been exiled twice. He had no steady income beyond what his writing brought in. And there was his African ancestry, which some in Moscow society still whispered about. The courtship dragged on for 2 years. Pushkin proposed and was neither accepted nor rejected, just kept in limbo while Natalia's mother considered her options. The uncertainty was torture. Pushkin wrote love letters, poems, anything to convince the family that he was a suitable match. He tried to prove his financial stability, his social connections, his favour with the Tsar. Finally, in April 1830, Natalia accepted. They would marry, but not immediately. There were financial arrangements to work out, property to settle, preparations to make. Pushkin's father agreed to give him part of the family estate at Boldino, about 200 miles east of Moscow. Pushkin would need to travel there to complete the legal formalities. He left Moscow in September 1830, expecting to be gone 2 weeks at most. He needed to survey the property, sign some documents, and return for the wedding. Simple enough. What actually happened would change Russian literature forever. When Pushkin arrived at Boldino, a cholera epidemic was spreading across Russia. Within days, quarantine was imposed. No one could travel. The roads were blocked. He was stuck in this remote estate, in the middle of nowhere, unable to return to Moscow, unable to see his fiancée, with nothing to do but wait out the disease. So he wrote. And what he wrote in those 3 months stands as one of the most extraordinary, creative outbursts in literary history. He completed the final chapters of Eugene Onegin. He wrote 4 short plays he called The Little Tragedies, each examining a different form of human obsession: greed, envy, lust, nihilism. He produced a cycle of prose tales, the Tales of Belkin, experiments in narrative voice, an unreliable narration that anticipated techniques later writers would spend decades developing. The plays were particularly remarkable. Mozart and Salieri explored the relationship between genius and mediocrity, imagining Salieri poisoning Mozart out of jealousy for gifts he could recognize but never possess. The Stone Guest retold the Don Juan story with psychological depth that made the libertine's final damnation feel inevitable rather than arbitrary. A Feast During the Plague examined how people respond to death when it's all around them, the gallows humour and desperate hedonism that emerge when normal life becomes impossible. These weren't just exercises. They were profound meditations on creativity, mortality, and the nature of evil. And he wrote them in weeks, sometimes days, one after another, as if the isolation and anxiety about the cholera and the wedding and his future had concentrated his powers to an almost supernatural degree. The prose tales were equally innovative. The shot played with narrative chronology in ways Russian literature hadn't seen before. The station master took a stock comic character, the lowly postal clerk everyone mocked, and revealed his human dignity and tragedy. The blizzard used weather as both plot device and metaphor, the storm that separates lovers becoming an image of fate's arbitrary power. What Pushkin discovered at Boldino was prose. He'd always been primarily a poet, but these tales showed what Russian prose could do. They were clear, economical, unsentimental. They moved quickly, without the digressions and philosophical asides that characterized most Russian fiction of the period. They trusted the reader to understand without endless explanation. When the quarantine finally lifted in late November, Pushkin returned to Moscow with enough material to fill several books. He was 31 years old, about to be married, and he'd just produced work that would influence Russian literature for the next century. Not a bad 3 months, even if he'd spent them trapped by disease in the middle of rural nowhere. The wedding took place on February 18th, 1831, in Moscow. Natalia wore white, Pushkin wore his dress uniform. During the ceremony, his candle went out, then hers, then he dropped the wedding ring. Superstitious friends later claimed these were omens. Pushkin, who claimed not to believe in such things, but secretly did, was shaken. The marriage itself was complicated from the start. Natalia was beautiful, charming, and 16 years younger than him. She'd grown up in provincial isolation and had no real understanding of the literary world Pushkin inhabited. She loved society, balls, attention. Pushkin loved writing, solitude, intellectual conversation. They were, in most ways that mattered, completely incompatible. But he adored her. Not just her beauty, though that was part of it. He adored the idea of her, the perfect woman he'd imagined, the muse who would inspire his greatest work. The problem was that Natalia wasn't an idea. She was a real person with her own desires and needs, most of which had nothing to do with poetry. They moved to Petersburg, where Pushkin had to navigate court society more carefully than ever. His wife's beauty made her an immediate sensation. Everyone wanted to see her, dance with her, be near her, including the Tsar. Nicholas I made his admiration for Natalia embarrassingly obvious. He arranged for her to be invited to all the important court functions. He danced with her at balls. He made sure the Pushkins were financially dependent on imperial favour. In December 1833, Nicholas granted Pushkin a court rank, Kammerjunker, essentially a gentleman of the bedchamber. The position was usually given to young men in their early 20s, not to established writers in their mid-30s. The humiliation was intentional. The rank gave Natalia access to court balls, which was what Nicholas wanted. It made Pushkin a servant, which was what Nicholas needed. Pushkin understood exactly what was happening. His letters from this period are bitter, angry, trapped. He wanted to resign, to leave Petersburg, to escape to his estate, and just write. But he couldn't. He had debts. He had a family to support. 4 children eventually. Maria, Alexander, Grigory, Natalia. And he had the Tsar's attention, which was both protection and prison. The work continued, but it was harder now. Court obligations consumed his time. Financial pressures mounted. The censorship became more unpredictable. In 1836, he started a literary journal, The Contemporary, hoping to create an income stream and a platform for serious writing. It failed financially almost immediately, adding to his debts and anxieties. He was writing prose more now, partly because it was faster to produce, partly because the forms interested him. The Queen of Spades, published in 1834, explored obsession and gambling through the story of an officer who learns a secret to winning at cards and destroys himself pursuing it. The Captain's Daughter, completed in 1836, was a historical novel about the Pugachev Rebellion, blending romance with serious meditation on loyalty, honour and power. These works showed Pushkin moving towards something new, a mature prose style that could handle complex narratives and psychological depth, but he'd never have time to fully develop it. Because between the literary ambitions and the financial reality was a growing gap that Pushkin couldn't bridge. The Russian book market in the 1830s was tiny. The educated class that could read literature numbered maybe 10,000 people across the entire empire. Of those, perhaps a few hundred would actually buy books. The rest borrowed, shared, or read in journals. This meant even successful writers couldn't live on their work alone. They needed patronage, government positions, wealthy sponsors. Pushkin had all of these, and it still wasn't enough. His debts in 1836 stood at roughly 120,000 rubles. His annual income from all sources, including his government salary and literary earnings, was perhaps 40,000. The math didn't work, and everyone knew it. The Tsar knew it particularly well. Nicholas understood that a man in debt is a man who can be controlled. So the imperial loans kept coming, always with strings attached, always with the implicit understanding that Pushkin would remain available, visible, useful, and Natalia would keep appearing at court functions. The social dynamics of Petersburg high society were brutal and specific. Women's reputations existed to be destroyed. The slightest impropriety, real or imagined, could become a scandal. And scandal was entertainment in a world where entertainment was scarce. Natalia's beauty made her a target. Her husband's literary fame made the target bigger. The fact that she enjoyed attention and wasn't particularly careful about propriety made everything worse. Letters from this period show Pushkin becoming increasingly paranoid about his wife's behaviour. When he was away, which was often, he wrote asking who she'd danced with, who'd visited, what people were saying. His tone shifted between tender affection and thinly veiled interrogation. She seemed genuinely confused by his jealousy. From her perspective, she was doing exactly what was expected of her. She attended balls. She was charming. She danced with important men. This was how court society worked. Why was he making it difficult? The disconnect was fundamental. Pushkin wanted a wife who would be content with domestic life and his literary world. Natalia wanted the glamour and excitement she'd been raised to expect as a beautiful noblewoman. Neither was wrong exactly. They just wanted incompatible things. Into this situation walked Georges Dantes. He arrived in Petersburg in 1833, a French royalist who'd fled France after the 1830 revolution. He was 21 years old, handsome, charming, ambitious. He joined the Russian military, specifically the elite Chevalier Guard Regiment, which was essentially a social club for the most prestigious young officers. Baron Jacob van Heekeren, the Dutch ambassador to Russia, took an interest in Dantes. The nature of their relationship has been debated for nearly 2 centuries. Heekeren formally adopted Dantes in 1836, despite being only 11 years older. The adoption allowed Dantes to use Heekeren's title and diplomatic connections. Whether their relationship was paternal, romantic, or some complicated combination, Heekeren clearly saw Dantes as his protégé and devoted himself to advancing the younger man's career and social position. Dantes met Natalia at a ball in 1835. The attraction was immediate and obvious. He pursued her openly, dancing with her whenever possible, visiting the Pushkin home, writing letters. Whether Natalia encouraged this or simply failed to discourage it remains unclear. What's certain is that by late 1836, all of Petersburg was gossiping about it. Pushkin heard the rumours. Everyone made sure he heard them. Anonymous letters began arriving, mocking him as a cuckold. The first came in early November 1836. It was written in French and styled as a diploma inducting Pushkin into a fictional order of cuckolds. The letters weren't signed, but they'd clearly been distributed to multiple people. Pushkin's friends received copies. The humiliation was public and intentional. His first response was to challenge Dantes to a duel. This was the standard response to such insults in aristocratic society. You couldn't let attacks on your honour stand unanswered, but Heekeren intervened. He went to Pushkin and made a proposal. Dantes would marry Natalia's sister, Ekaterina Goncharova. This would end the improper attention to Natalia, restore everyone's honour, and avoid bloodshed. Pushkin, after days of agonizing, accepted. The wedding was scheduled for January 1837. The marriage solved nothing. Dantes continued pursuing Natalia, now with the added access that came from being family. He visited the Pushkin home regularly. He wrote letters. According to some accounts, he tried to arrange private meetings. What actually happened between them is impossible to determine with certainty. Natalia's later testimony insisted nothing improper occurred. Dantes claimed he was genuinely in love and that Natalia had encouraged him. Pushkin believed his wife was being harassed and his honour systematically destroyed. The psychological pressure on Pushkin during this period was immense. He was 47 years old, exhausted, in debt, creatively frustrated, and watching his wife become the subject of society gossip, he was powerless to stop. His letters from January 1837 show a man at the edge. The careful diplomat who'd navigated imperial censorship for years disappeared. In his place was someone raw, angry, done with pretense. On January 26th, he wrote a letter to Baron Hecarin that was essentially a declaration of war. The language was so insulting, so deliberately offensive, that a duel became inevitable. Pushkin called Hecarin a pimp who'd been arranging meetings between Dantes and Natalia. He questioned the nature of Hecarin's relationship with his adopted son in terms that left no room for misinterpretation. The letter was designed to provoke. It worked. Dantes, honor-bound to defend his adoptive father, immediately challenged Pushkin to a duel. Pushkin accepted. The date was set for January 27th, just 2 days away. Dueling had a specific culture in 19th century Russia. It was illegal but tolerated among the nobility. The ritual was formalized. You needed seconds, witnesses who would arrange the details and ensure the rules were followed. You agreed on weapons, distance, and conditions. The seconds for this duel were Konstantin Dantes, Pushkin's friend from Lyceum days, and Viscount Darkiak, a French officer who represented Dantes. They met to discuss terms. The duel would be fought with pistols at 20 paces. After the signal, the duelists could advance up to 10 paces before firing. If both missed, or both were wounded but still standing, they'd receive new pistols and continue. These were serious conditions. 20 paces was close range for pistols. Someone was very likely to get hurt or killed. Pushkin spent January 26th and the morning of January 27th putting his affairs in order. He burned papers, he wrote letters, he visited friends, he spent time with his children. Natalia knew something was wrong, but not specifically what. Pushkin had become expert at hiding his duels from her. This was his 21st challenge, though only a few had actually been fought. He knew how to manage the secrecy. On the afternoon of January 27th, he left his apartment around 4 o'clock. The winter sun was already setting. Petersburg in January was dark, cold, brutal. The temperature was well below freezing. The duel site was near the Black River, on the outskirts of the city. It was a common location for these affairs, far enough from the centre to avoid police interference, but accessible by sleigh. Pushkin arrived with Dantes. Dantes came with Darkiak. They met in a clearing surrounded by snow-covered trees. The light was fading fast. The seconds measured the distance, 20 paces. They marked barriers 10 paces from each position. The duelists could advance to those barriers before firing. The rules were explained. Dantes won the coin toss for first choice of position and weapon. He chose his pistol and his spot. Pushkin took the remaining position. He was wearing a heavy coat and a top hat. His face was calm. Multiple witnesses later commented on how composed he seemed. The signal was given. Both men started walking toward each other. The snow crunched under their boots. Their breath formed clouds in the frozen air. Dantes reached his barrier first and stopped. He raised his pistol and aimed. Pushkin was still advancing when Dantes fired. The bullet struck Pushkin's right hip. The force spun him partially around and dropped him to the ground. The heavy coat had probably slowed the bullet slightly, but it still penetrated deep, passing through his abdomen and lodging near his spine. Pushkin fell but didn't lose consciousness. He called out that he still had the right to fire. The rules of dueling were specific about this. The man who fired first had to stand and wait for his opponent's shot. Dantes stood at his barrier, waiting. Pushkin, lying in the snow, propped himself up on his left arm. His right hand still held his pistol. He took aim and fired. The bullet struck Dantes in the right arm and chest. Later examination showed it hit a button on his uniform coat, which deflected it enough to prevent serious injury. He fell apparently badly wounded, but it was mostly shock and a flesh wound. Pushkin, seeing his opponent down, apparently believed he'd succeeded in killing or seriously wounding Dantes. He dropped his pistol. Then the pain hit. The seconds rushed over. Dantes reached Pushkin first. It was immediately clear the wound was serious. The blood was already soaking through his coat. They needed to get him back to the city, to a doctor. They lifted him carefully into the sleigh. Every movement caused terrible pain. The ride back to his apartment took roughly half an hour. Witnesses said Pushkin remained conscious and even tried to joke to keep Dantes from panicking. But he knew. He'd seen enough wounds, read enough medical descriptions. A bullet in the abdomen was almost always fatal. Peritonitis would set in. There was no treatment for it. By the time they reached his apartment on the Moika Canal, word was already spreading through Petersburg. Natalia met them at the door. She'd known something was wrong when he left. Now she saw him being carried in, covered in blood. The doctors came, several of them. They examined the wound and confirmed what Pushkin already knew. The bullet had torn through his intestines. Infection was inevitable. Death would follow, probably within days. Pushkin asked them to be honest with him. They were. He had perhaps 48 hours, maybe less. What happened over those next 2 days has been reconstructed from multiple accounts. Friends visited. Messages arrived from the Tsar, who apparently was genuinely upset and offered to cover Pushkin's debts and provide for his family. Pushkin dictated letters, said goodbye to his children, and prepared to die. He remained conscious almost to the end. The pain was extraordinary. 19th century medicine had little to offer beyond opium, which helped slightly, but not enough. Natalia stayed with him. Whatever had or hadn't happened with Dantes, whatever the state of their marriage, she was there. The accounts suggest genuine grief and guilt, though reading emotions across nearly 2 centuries is inherently uncertain. Pushkin died at 2:45 p.m. on January 29, 1837. He was 37 years old. His last coherent words were reportedly about the pain and a request to be left alone to die in peace. The news spread through Petersburg within hours. The reaction was immediate and intense. Pushkin had been Russia's greatest living poet. His death from a duel over a society scandal seemed wasteful, tragic, almost obscene. The government, nervous about public demonstrations, immediately took control of the funeral arrangements. They feared the crowds that Pushkin's death might attract. Revolutionary sentiment could crystallize around a martyr, especially one who'd been known for his liberal sympathies in youth. The authorities moved the funeral to a smaller church, changed the time without public announcement, and limited attendance to close family and specifically approved guests. They wanted to prevent Pushkin's funeral from becoming a political demonstration. It didn't work. Thousands showed up anyway. The church of Konyushenaya was packed. People filled the street outside. They came despite the official restrictions, despite the cold, despite knowing the government was watching and taking names. The viewing of the body took place in Pushkin's apartment. Over the course of several days, an estimated 50,000 people filed through. 50,000 in a city where such gatherings were normally forbidden. The government tried to downplay it, but the sheer scale made that impossible. Among the mourners was Mikhail Lermontov, a young poet who'd admired Pushkin from a distance. The death hit him hard, and within days he wrote a poem called Death of a Poet. It circulated in manuscript form, passed from hand to hand, copied and recopied. The poem was inflammatory. Lermontov didn't just mourn Pushkin. He blamed the court, the aristocracy, the entire social system that had created the conditions for the duel. He accused them of destroying Russia's greatest poet for their own amusement. You, greedy crowd, are standing by the throne, executioners of freedom, genius, and glory. You hide behind the shelter of the law. Before you, right and justice must be silent. The authorities were furious. Lermontov was arrested, interrogated, and eventually exiled to the Caucasus. His career as a poet was just beginning, but he'd already learned what Pushkin had known. In Russia, writing could be dangerous. The actual burial happened far from Petersburg. The government ordered Pushkin's body transported to the Sviatogorsky monastery near his mother's estate at Mikhailovskoye. The journey was conducted quietly, almost secretly, with a single gendarme escorting the coffin. This was deliberate. They wanted Pushkin buried in an isolated location, far from the capital, where his grave might become a gathering point for dissidents. The funeral service at the monastery was small. Pushkin's close friend, Alexander Turgenev, arranged everything. Only a handful of people attended. The poet, who'd drawn thousands in Petersburg, was buried with almost no witnesses. He was laid to rest in the monastery cemetery, next to his mother, who died a few years earlier. The location was quiet, rural, utterly unlike the glittering society life that had consumed his final years. Within weeks, the recriminations began. Who was responsible for Pushkin's death? The obvious answer was Dantes, who'd pulled the trigger. But was he really the villain? Public opinion in Petersburg divided sharply. Some blamed Dantes entirely, seeing him as a calculating seducer who deliberately provoked the duel. Others blamed Natalia for her flirtations and poor judgment. Still others blamed the system itself, the toxic court culture that turned personal matters into public scandals. The Tsar issued a statement expressing grief and offering financial support for Pushkin's family. Whether this was genuine or political calculation is impossible to know. Nicholas I had a complicated relationship with Pushkin, alternating between patronage and surveillance. What's clear is that the Tsar understood the political implications. Pushkin's death created a martyr. The government needed to appear sympathetic while also preventing any revolutionary sentiment from crystallizing around his memory. Dantes faced surprisingly few consequences. He wasn't arrested or charged with murder. Dueling was technically illegal, but prosecutions were rare, especially when the participants were from aristocratic families. Instead, Dantes was expelled from Russia. He and his wife, Ekaterina Goncharova, Natalia's sister, left for France within weeks of the duel. He eventually inherited a title and served in the French Senate. He lived until 1895, dying at the age of 83, having outlived Pushkin by 58 years. Did he feel guilt? His later statements suggest not particularly. He maintained that Pushkin had insulted him and that the duel was therefore justified. He positioned himself as the wronged party, forced to defend his honor. This interpretation found little sympathy in Russia, where opinion hardened against him over time. He became, in Russian cultural memory, the foreigner who'd killed the nation's greatest poets. Natalia Pushkina's fate was different and more complicated. She was 24 years old, a widow with 4 young children and considerable debts. The Tsar's financial assistance helped, but her social position was difficult. The immediate question was whether she bore responsibility for Pushkin's death. Society gossip blamed her flirtations for provoking the situation. Some accounts portrayed her as vain and thoughtless, a beautiful woman who'd enjoyed the attention without considering the consequences. Other accounts defend her. She was young, trapped in a marriage with a jealous, difficult man, navigating a court culture where flirtation was expected but also dangerous. Whether she actually had an affair with Dantes remains unclear. The evidence is circumstantial and contradictory. What we know is that she mourned genuinely and deeply. She wore black for years afterward and reportedly felt tremendous guilt. Whether that guilt was for betrayal or simply for the circumstances is impossible to determine. 7 years after Pushkin's death, she remarried. Her second husband was General Pyotr Lanskoy, a dignified officer who treated her well and helped raise Pushkin's children. They had 3 daughters together. She lived until 1863, dying at age 51. Her children carried the Pushkin name forward. The eldest daughter, Maria, became known as a possible inspiration for Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, though this is disputed. The youngest daughter, also named Natalia, married into minor European nobility and left Russia. The sons Alexander and Grigory both became military officers. Neither achieved the fame of their father, but they carried his legacy, and their descendants still exist today, scattered across Europe. But what mattered most wasn't the family's continuation. It was Pushkin's work, which began its transformation from contemporary literature into something larger and more permanent. The problem was that much of Pushkin's genius is essentially untranslatable. His verse relies on the specific sounds and structures of Russian. The word order, the rhythm, the internal rhymes, these work in Russian in ways that resist conversion to other languages. Eugene Onegin is the clearest example. Vladimir Nabokov, himself a brilliant Russian writer fluent in English, spent years working on a translation. What he produced was rigidly literal, preserving every meaning but abandoning any attempt at poetic form. Nabokov argued this was the only honest approach. Any translation that tried to maintain the poetry would inevitably betray the meaning. Better to sacrifice beauty and preserve accuracy. Other translators disagreed, producing versions that attempted to capture the spirit, if not the letter. These read more smoothly in English, but often feel distant from Pushkin's original voice. This translation problem means that Pushkin's international reputation has never matched his Russian standing. In Russia, he's unquestionably the greatest poet. In the English-speaking world, he's respected but not widely read, known more as a historical figure than as a living presence in literature. The immediate impact of his death on Russian literature was profound. Lermontov's career had been launched by his response to Pushkin's death. Other writers, including Gogol and Turgenev, spoke of Pushkin as the foundation on which they built. What Pushkin had done was create a literary Russian language that could handle complex ideas, subtle emotions, and sophisticated artistry. Before him, Russian literature largely imitated French models. After him, it became distinctly Russian. The Bronze Horseman, that narrative poem about the Petersburg flood, became a touchstone for later writers thinking about Russia's relationship to its own history. Dostoevsky and others returned to its themes repeatedly. Eugene Onegin established the template for the Russian novel. The superfluous man, the educated character unable to find meaningful purpose in society, became a recurring type. Turgenev, Goncharov, and Chekhov all explored variations on this figure. Pushkin's fairy tales, those verse stories he'd written partly from memories of his childhood nurses' stories, became beloved classics. Russian children grew up with The Tale of Tsar Sultan and The Tale of the Golden Cockerel, the way English children knew Mother Goose. His influence extended beyond literature into Russian cultural identity itself. The language he'd shaped became the medium through which Russians understood themselves. His works provided reference points, common touchstones that educated Russians all shared. This process accelerated through the 19th century. By mid-century, Pushkin had become canonical, required reading, the standard against which other writers were measured. The Soviet period brought new complications. Pushkin's aristocratic background and connections to the Tsarist court made him potentially problematic. But the regime needed cultural heroes, and Pushkin was too important to discard. So they reinterpreted him. His early political poems, the ones that had gotten him exiled, were emphasized. His later accommodation with the Tsar was downplayed or explained as forced compromise. Pushkin became a progressive, even a proto-revolutionary, who'd been destroyed by the old regime. This wasn't entirely false. Pushkin had written radical verse as a young man. He had been friends with Decembrists. He had suffered under censorship and surveillance, but it simplified a more complicated reality. The Soviet approach also meant massive promotion of Pushkin's work. His poems were taught in schools, his image appeared on currency, statues were erected. The Pushkin Museum in Moscow became one of the country's most important cultural institutions. This had the effect of making Pushkin even more central to Russian identity. Generations grew up with his works as fundamental texts, memorizing passages, studying every detail. After the Soviet collapse, the interpretation shifted again. Pushkin could now be appreciated as an artist rather than an ideological symbol. His complexity, his contradictions, his very human flaws became acceptable to discuss. What emerged was a more nuanced understanding. Pushkin the genius poet, yes, but also Pushkin the difficult husband, the compulsive gambler, the man destroyed partly by his own choices. This didn't diminish him. If anything, it made him more interesting, more real. The transformation from person to monument and back to person enriched rather than reduced his legacy. Today, Pushkin's position in Russian culture remains unique. He's not just a great writer, he's the writer, the foundational figure, the source from which Russian literature flows. Every June 6th, his birthday is celebrated across Russia. Streets, squares, and institutions bear his name. His works remain in print continuously. School children still memorize his verses. This level of cultural permanence is rare. Few writers achieve it in any language. Shakespeare in English, Dante in Italian, perhaps Goethe in German. These figures transcend literature to become part of national identity itself. For Pushkin, this happened relatively quickly. Within a generation of his death, he'd achieved canonical status. Within a century, he was untouchable, beyond criticism, elevated to a level where his works were studied, but his genius was simply assumed. The question this raises is whether we can still see Pushkin clearly. Has the cultural weight distorted our view? Can we separate the actual works from their accumulated significance? Probably not entirely, but that might not matter, because what Pushkin represents now is larger than what he wrote. He's become a symbol of Russian language and identity, a figure who embodies certain ideals about art, freedom, and national character. Whether the historical Pushkin fully matched those ideals is almost beside the point. The Pushkin who matters is the one who exists in Russian cultural memory, the poet whose words shaped how generations understood themselves and their world. This raises uncomfortable questions about artistic legacy. Can we separate the work from the mythology surrounding it? Should we? The answer matters because Pushkin's case isn't unique. Every culture has foundational figures whose real lives get obscured by their symbolic importance. But the obscuring changes what we can learn from them. Take Pushkin's relationship with power. The actual historical record is complex and contradictory. He wrote revolutionary verses as a young man, suffered exile, lived under surveillance, but he also accepted positions at court, sought the Tsar's favour, became dependent on imperial patronage. This isn't hypocrisy exactly. It's the messy reality of being an artist in an autocratic system. You need support to survive. You make compromises. You find ways to say what you want, while appearing to say what's acceptable. The simplified versions erase this complexity. Revolutionary Pushkin versus court Pushkin. Victim versus collaborator. These binaries miss the actual person who was both and neither, who navigated impossible contradictions because that's what survival required. His marriage to Natalia Goncharova illustrates the same problem. The romantic narrative presents it as a love match destroyed by jealousy and court intrigue. True enough, but incomplete. Pushkin was 31 when he married the 18-year-old Natalia. She was extraordinarily beautiful, from a good family, but without money. He was famous, but also problematic, politically suspect, not wealthy despite his success. The marriage made sense for both of them, but it also trapped them. Natalia's beauty made her valuable in court society, the very environment Pushkin found suffocating. Her presence there was required. His presence was tolerated but resented. 4 children arrived quickly. Money was always tight. Pushkin gambled, borrowed, struggled with debt. Natalia loved society, the attention, the dancing. Pushkin wanted to write, to work, to escape Petersburg's social demands. The letters between them reveal affection but not passion. Pushkin's tone is often teasing, sometimes crude, rarely tender. Natalia's responses, the few that survive, are dutiful but distant. When Georges Dantes appeared in 1835, handsome and French and charming, paying elaborate attention to Natalia, it created exactly the crisis Pushkin feared. Not necessarily because Natalia was unfaithful, though maybe she was, but because the appearance of impropriety was damaging enough. Court society thrived on gossip. Pushkin's position was already precarious. His wife's reputation affected his own. The anonymous letters calling him a cuckold were designed to provoke exactly the response they got. Pushkin challenged Dantes. Friends intervened. Dantes married Natalia's sister, Ekaterina, which should have resolved things. It didn't. The insults remained. The gossip continued. Pushkin wrote Dantes a letter so viciously insulting that a duel became inevitable. He wanted it to happen. He needed to restore his honor, even if it cost him everything. Which it did. The bullet that entered his abdomen on January 27, 1837 killed him slowly, over 2 days. The wound was immediately recognized as fatal. Pushkin knew it. He settled his affairs, received visitors, said goodbye. The question that haunts the story is whether he wanted to die. Not consciously, perhaps, but he'd engineered a situation where death was a likely outcome. He was a good shot. Dantes was a military officer. Either could have killed the other. Pushkin fired second and missed, or aimed to wound rather than kill. The evidence is unclear. What's clear is that he put himself in a position where his survival depended on luck and the other man's mercy. This suggests something darker than romantic tragedy. Pushkin, at 37, was exhausted, in debt, creatively frustrated, trapped in a life he hated. The duel offered an honourable exit. Death would solve his problems and cement his legacy. Maybe that's too dark. Maybe he simply miscalculated, thought he could wound Dantes and survive, restore his reputation, and continue living. We'll never know his actual intentions. What we know is what happened next. The outpouring of grief was immediate and genuine. Thousands came to view the body. The government, fearing demonstrations, moved the funeral to a smaller church, limited attendance, sent the body for burial at night under police escort. Even in death, Pushkin was dangerous. His funeral became a political event, despite official attempts to prevent it. The public mourning exceeded anything the authorities had anticipated. Within months, the myth-making began. Pushkin the martyr, killed by a foreigner, destroyed by court intrigue, a victim of the system he'd criticized. The narrative simplified, hardened, became fixed. Later generations inherited this simplified version. Soviet authorities found it useful. Pushkin the progressive, destroyed by Tsarist society. The duel as class conflict, the old regime murdering its greatest genius. Post-Soviet interpretation allowed more nuance but couldn't entirely escape the accumulated weight of meaning. Pushkin had become too important as a symbol to be fully understood as a person. This creates a strange situation. We have more information about Pushkin than almost any other Russian writer of his era. Thousands of letters, documents, contemporary accounts. Yet he remains mysterious because the mythology obscures him. His work survived this process better than his biography. The poems and stories don't require belief in any particular version of Pushkin's life. They function independently, speaking across time regardless of what we think about their creator. Eugene Onegin doesn't care whether Pushkin was a revolutionary or a conformist. The Bronze Horseman doesn't depend on his marriage being happy or tragic. The fairy tales work whether he was a good father or absent. This is literature's advantage over biography. The work detaches from its creator and finds its own life. What Pushkin intended matters less than what his words actually do. But the biographical questions persist because we can't help wanting to understand the source. How does someone produce work this good? What kind of mind creates Eugene Onegin? What life experiences shape the Bronze Horseman? The search for answers leads back through the mythology to the fragmentary historical record. And there we find not a monument, but a person. Complicated, contradictory, often difficult. Pushkin was vain about his appearance despite being short and not conventionally handsome. He was proud of his African heritage, but also defensive about it. He could be generous and petty, brilliant and childish, brave and foolish. He had terrible judgment about money, worse judgment about gambling. He picked fights he couldn't win. He fell in love repeatedly and disastrously. He made enemies unnecessarily. He was also capable of extraordinary focus and discipline. The productivity of the Boldino Autumns wasn't just talent. It was sustained, intense work. He could write for hours, revising endlessly, perfecting each line. His letters show someone deeply engaged with literary craft, thinking constantly about language, form, effect. He read widely, absorbed influences, transformed everything he touched into something distinctly his own. The fairy tales he heard from his nurse, Irina Rodionovna, became sophisticated literary creations that work on multiple levels. The French poets he admired in youth became foundations for a uniquely Russian poetic language. This combination of natural gift and relentless work produced the achievements we have, not despite his flaws, but including them. The gambling debt that sent him to Boldino created the conditions for his most productive period. The court life he hated gave him material he used brilliantly. Even the duel, the stupidly tragic ending, reinforced his legacy in ways a peaceful death wouldn't have. The dramatic exit, the young death, the sense of potential unfulfilled, all of it fed the mythology that kept his work alive. So maybe the answer isn't to strip away the mythology entirely, but to understand its relationship to the reality. The monument and the man coexist. We need both. The monument gives us the cultural weight, the reason to pay attention across centuries. The man gives us the complexity, the flaws, the recognition that genius emerges from human beings who are never simply heroic. Pushkin, the symbol, represents Russian literary achievement, national identity, linguistic mastery. Pushkin, the person, was a short, curly-haired man with gambling debts and a complicated marriage who happened to write better than almost anyone else. Both versions are true. Both matter. The tension between them is productive rather than problematic. It keeps the conversation alive, keeps people returning to the works, finding new meanings, arguing about interpretations. This is what literary immortality actually looks like. Not perfect preservation, but constant reinterpretation. Not fixed meaning, but evolving significance. Not a dead monument, but a living presence that each generation encounters differently. The works themselves tell a different story than the mythology. Read Eugene Onegin without knowing Pushkin's biography, and you encounter something that doesn't need historical context to land. The verse novel operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Surface level, it's a story about bored aristocrats, failed romance, a pointless duel. One level down, it's a meditation on Russian identity, European influence, the clash between natural feeling and social convention. Deeper still, it's an exploration of time itself, how people change, how moments pass, how what we want shifts beneath us. Tatiana's letter to Onegin remains one of literature's great declarations of love. She writes it knowing she shouldn't, knowing the risk, unable to stop herself. The honesty burns through every line. When Onegin rejects her, choosing sophisticated detachment over vulnerability, the moment crystallizes something about emotional cowardice that transcends its specific historical setting. Years later, when she rejects him in turn, married and transformed, the reversal isn't just plot mechanics. It's the recognition that timing matters, that people don't remain available, that hesitation has consequences. This isn't Russian literature, requiring translation notes and historical footnotes to make sense. This is human psychology, rendered with precision that still cuts. The fact that it's also written in an intricate verse form, maintaining rhythm and rhyme while never sacrificing naturalness, makes the achievement more remarkable. Pushkin makes difficulty look effortless. The Bronze Horseman works differently. It's shorter, denser, built around a central image of Peter the Great's statue. The poem tells the story of a clerk named Evgeny, caught in the devastating 1824 flood that submerged Petersburg. He survives, but his fiancée drowns. Mad with grief, he confronts the Bronze Horseman, blaming Peter for building the city on swampland, for valuing imperial ambition over human life. The statue comes alive and chases him through the streets. On one level, it's a ghost story. On another, it's political philosophy. The individual versus the state. Personal tragedy versus historical necessity. Peter built Petersburg as Russia's window to Europe, forcing modernity on a reluctant nation. Thousands died in the construction. The city floods regularly, claiming more lives. Was it worth it? The poem doesn't answer. It holds the tension, showing both Evgeny's genuine suffering and Peter's genuine vision. Neither cancels the other out. Scholars have spent careers analysing the Bronze Horseman's ambiguity. Is Pushkin praising Peter or condemning him, supporting autocracy or critiquing it? The text supports multiple readings because Pushkin built in the contradictions deliberately. He understood that complex questions don't have simple answers, that you can acknowledge both sides without resolving them into easy certainty. This approach to ambiguity influenced every Russian writer who came after. Dostoevsky's Underground Man, Tolstoy's historical fatalism, Chekhov's refusal of neat endings. They all descend partly from Pushkin's willingness to leave questions open. Not because he couldn't decide, but because he recognized that some tensions are permanent. The fairy tales show yet another dimension. The tale of Tsar Sultan, the tale of the dead princess, the tale of the golden cockerel. These draw on the folk stories Arina Rodionovna told him during the Mikhailovskoye exile. But Pushkin wasn't just transcribing oral tradition. He was transforming it into literary art, while maintaining its essential character. The language stays simple and direct. The rhythms echo folk poetry. The plots keep their fairy tale logic, where magic operates according to rules that don't need explanation. But layered into this simplicity are sophisticated narrative techniques, psychological insight, social commentary. A child can enjoy these stories on their own terms. An adult finds depths that weren't visible before. This range, from the complex verse novel to the seemingly simple fairy tale, all executed at the highest level, demonstrates versatility that's genuinely rare. Most writers find one thing they do well and repeat it. Pushkin kept expanding, trying new forms, mastering different registers, refusing to settle into comfortable expertise. The prose works extend this pattern. The Queen of Spades operates as both supernatural thriller and psychological study. Hermann, obsessed with learning the secret of winning at cards, manipulates an old countess who supposedly knows a guaranteed system. She dies without revealing it. Her ghost appears and gives him 3 winning cards. He bets everything on them. The 3rd card fails. He goes mad. Is the ghost real or hallucination? The story allows both readings. The supernatural elements feel genuine within the narrative logic, but Hermann's deteriorating mental state provides a rationalist explanation. Pushkin maintains the ambiguity perfectly, making the story work on either interpretation. The Captain's Daughter takes a different approach. It's historical fiction about the Pugachev rebellion, told as the memoir of a minor nobleman who gets caught up in the uprising. The narrator, Pyotr Grinev, meets Pugachev by chance during a snowstorm before the rebellion starts. Later, when Pugachev has become a rebel leader, threatening Grinev's life, he remembers the earlier kindness and spares him. The novel explores questions of honor, loyalty, and historical forces beyond individual control. Grinev tries to navigate between his duty to the Empress and his personal debt to Pugachev. The rebellion fails, as everyone reading knows it will, but Pushkin focuses on the human level, showing how people make choices in impossible situations. What ties all these works together is the consistent intelligence behind them. Pushkin thought clearly about difficult questions. He observed human behavior with unusual accuracy. He understood how language works, how rhythm and sound create meaning beyond the literal content of words, and he worked relentlessly to get it right, revising, refining, perfecting. The letters to friends show someone constantly thinking about craft. He discusses specific lines, debates translation choices, analyzes what makes one version stronger than another. This wasn't spontaneous genius, pouring out effortlessly. It was conscious artistry backed by natural talent and years of practice. But conscious artistry can produce dead, mechanical work if it's not animated by genuine feeling. Pushkin's work lives because he cared about what he was writing. The emotional stakes were real for him. When he writes about exile, you feel the isolation. When he writes about love, you feel the desire and the loss. When he writes about Russia, you feel the complicated mixture of affection and frustration. This combination of technical mastery and authentic feeling creates work that resonates beyond its immediate context. You don't need to know about Nicholas I's censorship to understand what it means to have your voice suppressed. You don't need to know about 1830s Petersburg society to recognize social pressure and personal compromise. The specific details ground the work in reality, but the underlying patterns are universal enough to travel. Translation remains the major barrier to Pushkin's global reputation. Poetry depends on sound, rhythm, word choice in ways that prose doesn't. When you translate Eugene Onegin into English, you can preserve the plot, the characters, the basic meaning, but the Onegin stanza, that intricate rhyme scheme Pushkin invented, doesn't survive. The wordplay vanishes. The musicality disappears. Nabokov's translation chose accuracy over beauty, providing detailed notes explaining what got lost. Others attempt to recreate the verse form in English, accepting that some meaning will shift in the process. Neither approach fully captures what makes the original work. This isn't the translator's failure. Some things are genuinely untranslatable. Russian readers have an advantage here. They can experience Pushkin's language directly, hear the rhythms he intended, catch the nuances that disappear in translation. This creates a disconnect between Pushkin's reputation in Russia, where he's foundational and omnipresent, and his reputation elsewhere, where he's respected but not deeply known. But even in translation, enough survives to demonstrate why he matters. The intelligence comes through. The structural innovations remain visible. The psychological insight translates. You can recognize the achievement, even when you can't fully experience it. The influence extends beyond direct literary descendants. Pushkin established templates that Russian culture kept using. The superfluous man, the alienated intellectual, unable to find purpose, appears in Onegin, and then echoes through Lermontov, Turgenev, Goncharov. The little man crushed by bureaucratic indifference shows up in The Bronze Horseman, and then in Gogol, Dostoevsky, Chekhov. The tension between Russian and European identity that runs through Eugene Onegin becomes a permanent theme in Russian thought. These weren't just plot devices Pushkin invented. They were ways of understanding Russian experience that proved durably useful. Each generation found new applications for the basic patterns. The specific social conditions changed, but the underlying questions remained relevant. This durability suggests that Pushkin identified something essential rather than merely capturing his particular moment. The best art does both simultaneously. It's completely of its time and also transcends that time. It's rooted in specific circumstances, but addresses concerns that outlast those circumstances. Pushkin managed this in multiple genres across a relatively short career. The breadth of accomplishment in just 17 years of mature work is staggering. He created the verse novel, revolutionized Russian drama, established prose fiction as a serious literary form in Russian, wrote lyric poetry that set the standard for generations, composed fairy tales that became cultural touchstones. Any one of these would constitute a significant achievement. Doing all of them represents something close to literary omnipotence. The tragic early death adds to the sense of potential unfulfilled. What would he have written in his 40s, 50s, 60s? Would he have continued innovating or settled into repeating successful formulas? Would he have moved toward longer prose works like the generation that followed? We'll never know. The duel cut off the possibilities, but maybe the early death was almost necessary to the legacy. Dying at 37, at the height of his powers, prevented decline. There's no late period of diminished work to qualify the achievement. Everything that exists is prime Pushkin. The mythology benefits from the dramatic exit, even as the actual loss was enormous. What remains is the work. Imperfect in places, uneven in quality, like anyone's complete output, but at its best, representing achievement that hasn't been exceeded. Eugene Onegin stands alongside the greatest long poems in any language. The Bronze Horseman demonstrates what short narrative verse can accomplish. The fairy tales prove that simplicity and sophistication aren't opposites. The prose shows mastery of yet another form. This is what literary genius actually looks like. Not superhuman perfection, but sustained excellence across multiple domains. Not one masterpiece, but many, each different from the others, each pushing in new directions. Not easy success, but work produced despite obstacles, censorship, exile, financial pressure, personal chaos. The man who created all this was flawed, difficult, sometimes foolish. He made bad decisions. He hurt people who loved him. He died for stupid reasons. But he also produced work that changed what Russian literature could be, that influenced everyone who came after, that continues speaking to readers who encounter it genuinely. That's the real legacy, not the monument in Petersburg or the museum at Mikhailovskoye or the endless scholarly studies, the poems themselves, the stories, the language that created new possibilities for expressing Russian experience. 200 years gone, and the words still work, still create meaning, still demonstrate what literature can accomplish when talent, craft and vision align. The man lying in that house in Essex in 1704 couldn't have known that his framework would shape 3 centuries of political thought. John Locke died believing he'd contributed to English debates about government and knowledge. What actually happened was that he'd created a language for thinking about power that would travel farther than he ever did. The American Revolution spoke Locke's language. The French Revolution twisted it toward purposes he'd have rejected. Liberal democracies built themselves on foundations he'd laid. And every debate about rights, consent, and legitimate authority traces back to arguments he made while hiding from a king who wanted him silenced. But here's what's strange. The more influential Locke became, the less visible he was as an actual person. The works detached from their author. The ideas grew beyond their origins. What remained was the framework, not the man. Most people invoking Lockean principles couldn't tell you basic facts about his life. They just used the vocabulary he created without knowing they're doing it. This is both success and erasure. The ideas won completely. They became so fundamental to modern politics that they feel like common sense rather than someone's invention. Natural rights, social contract, consent of the governed, these seem obvious now because Locke made them seem obvious, but they weren't inevitable. They had to be thought, argued, defended. Someone had to do the work of transforming political philosophy from divine right theory into something closer to what we recognize as democracy. That someone was careful, calculating, terrified of persecution. He published anonymously. He denied writing his most important works. He He spent years in exile. Everything about his life suggested caution rather than revolution. Yet the ideas were revolutionary, whether he intended them that way or not. The contradictions matter because they reveal how influence actually works. You don't have to be a revolutionary to spark revolutions. You don't have to intend radical consequences for your ideas to produce them. You just have to identify principles that prove more powerful than you realized, then let them loose in the world. Locke thought he was defending a particular political settlement in England. Instead, he created tools that people used to challenge every political settlement everywhere. The slave traders quoted him on property rights. The abolitionists quoted him on natural liberty. Both claimed him as their authority. Both found support in his writings. This isn't because Locke was incoherent. It's because he articulated principles without fully working through their implications. Or maybe he worked through the implications and deliberately left them ambiguous because clarity would have been dangerous. Either way, what he left behind was powerful and incomplete. A framework strong enough to build on, but open enough to allow wildly different constructions. The authorship question that consumed scholars for decades now looks like the wrong question. Whether one particular man from Stratford wrote Shakespeare's plays matters less than what those plays accomplished. Whether one particular philosopher from Somerset wrote the second treatise matters less than what that treatise enabled. The work exists, the influence is real. The biographical details, fascinating as they are, don't change what the ideas did in the world, but they do change how we understand the relationship between thought and action. Locke wasn't a man of action. He was a man who thought carefully about action, about when it was justified, about what made authority legitimate or illegitimate. He spent his life writing rather than fighting, and the writing proved more powerful than any battle he might have fought. This suggests something about ideas as historical forces. They don't need to be perfectly consistent or fully developed. They just need to identify tensions that people already feel but haven't articulated. Locke's arguments about consent and natural rights resonated because people already sensed that absolute monarchy was problematic. He gave them the language to express that sense, the logical structure to defend it. Once that language existed, it couldn't be taken back. You can ban books, you can exile writers, you can execute rebels, but you can't unmake an idea that's already spread. The second treatise circulated despite official disapproval. The arguments appeared in pamphlets, letters, conversations. By the time authorities recognized how dangerous the ideas were, they'd already reproduced beyond control. This is the pattern that keeps repeating. Someone articulates a principle. Others extend it beyond the author's intentions. The original author might object, might try to clarify, might insist on limitations. Too late. The idea has its own life now. It grows in directions the creator never imagined, used by people the creator would never have approved of, toward ends the creator might have opposed. Locke defended property rights and colonial expansion. Later thinkers used his framework to attack both. He supported religious toleration, except for atheists and Catholics. Later advocates of toleration extended it to everyone. He believed in natural rights but accepted slavery. Abolitionists used his own logic to condemn him. Each extension pushed beyond what Locke intended, but drew on principles he'd established. The framework was stronger than his application of it. The logic led places he wouldn't go. This is what happens when you build arguments on foundations like natural equality and consent. The foundations support structures you didn't plan. 3 centuries after his death, we're still building on those foundations. Every debate about government surveillance uses Lockean arguments about privacy and consent. Every discussion of economic regulation invokes his thoughts on property. Every controversy about civil disobedience references his theory of resistance. The vocabulary is modern, but the concepts are his. This durability comes partly from the questions he asked remaining relevant. What makes authority legitimate? When can people resist? What rights exist prior to government? These aren't 17th century questions. They're permanent questions about power and freedom that every generation confronts differently but never resolves finally. But durability also comes from the ambiguity he built in. Locke didn't answer everything. He couldn't have. The gaps and contradictions in his work create space for ongoing argument. Different interpreters find different things. The conversation continues because the text supports multiple readings. This makes him useful across political divides. Libertarians claim him. Liberals claim him. Even some socialists find resources in his labour theory of value. He's simultaneously conservative and radical, defender of property and critic of absolute power, supporter of stability and advocate for revolution. The contradictions aren't bugs. They're what makes the framework adaptable. The man himself remains shadowy, despite all the scholarship. We know the external facts, the movements, the publications, the connections. We don't know the interior life. Locke left no autobiography, few personal letters that reveal much, no diary where he processed his thoughts. What we have is the philosophical writing, carefully crafted, deliberately impersonal. This creates a particular kind of legacy, the ideas without the personality, the framework without the human complications. It's the opposite of how we typically think about genius, where the personal story supposedly illuminates the work. With Locke, the work is clear, but the person is opaque. Maybe that's appropriate. Maybe political philosophy benefits from this kind of impersonality. You can evaluate the arguments on their merits without getting distracted by the author's flaws or virtues. The second treatise doesn't require believing Locke was a hero or a saint. It just requires engaging with the logic. But something gets lost too. The sense of how ideas emerge from lived experience, the recognition that even abstract philosophy comes from someone trying to make sense of their particular moment. Locke wrote about resistance to tyranny while hiding from a king. He wrote about religious toleration while belonging to a religious minority. He wrote about property rights while trying to secure his own financial future. The personal circumstances don't determine the arguments, but they contextualize them. They show philosophy as a human activity rather than pure abstraction. Someone thinking through problems that matter because they're living through the consequences. The influence continues because the problems continue. As long as governments exist, questions about their legitimacy matter. As long as power is distributed unequally, questions about resistance matter. As long as people disagree about fundamental values, questions about rights and consent matter. Locke didn't solve these problems. He gave us better ways to think about them. That's what philosophical achievement actually looks like. Not final answers, but improved questions. Not certainty, but clarity about what we're arguing over. The works remain. The frameworks persist. The vocabulary shapes how we talk about politics, whether we know its origins or not. Consent of the governed, natural rights, separation of powers, limited government. These are Lockean concepts so deeply embedded in modern political discourse that they feel like discoveries rather than inventions. But they were invented. Someone had to think them, write them, defend them against alternatives that seemed more plausible at the time. That someone was cautious and careful, published anonymously, died quietly in a country house. The ideas he set loose were neither cautious nor quiet. They crossed oceans, sparked revolutions, reshaped how millions of people understood their relationship to power. 200 years after Locke died, his arguments were still being used to challenge monarchies, demand representation, insist on rights. 300 years later, they're still in play. Not because they're perfect or complete, but because they identified something essential about the tension between individual freedom and collective authority. That tension won't resolve. It's built into the structure of any society that tries to balance liberty with order, which means Locke's framework stays relevant not despite its age, but because of it. The questions he framed turn out to be permanent questions. The answers keep changing, but the questions remain. The man in that Essex house had no way of knowing any of this. He thought he was contributing to English political debates. He died believing his work might influence his country's government. What actually happened was that he changed how the world thinks about government itself. Not bad for someone who spent his life being careful, staying quiet, and trying not to get killed for his ideas. Sometimes the quietest voices echo longest.